Junky. Prologue. I was born in 1914 in a solid 3-story brick house in a large Midwest city. My parents were comfortable. My father owned and ran a lumber business. The house had a lawn in front, a backyard with a garden, a fish pond, and a high wooden fence all around it. I remember the lamplighter lighting the gas street lights and the huge black shiny Lincoln and drives in the park on Sunday. All the props of a safe, comfortable way of life that is now gone forever. Actually, my earliest memories are colored by a fear of nightmares. I was afraid to be alone and afraid of the dark, and afraid to go to sleep because of dreams where a supernatural horror seemed always on the point of taking shape. I was afraid someday the dream would still be there when I woke up. I recall hearing a maid talk about opium and how smoking opium brings sweet dreams, and I said, I will smoke opium when I grow up. I was subject to hallucinations as a child. Once I woke up in the early morning light and saw little men playing in a blockhouse I had made. I felt no fear, only a feeling of stillness and wonder. Another recurrent hallucination, or nightmare, concerned animals in the wall, and started with the delirium of a strange, undiagnosed fever that I had at the age of 4 or 5. I went to a progressive school with the future solid citizens, the lawyers, doctors, and businessmen of a large Midwest town. I was timid with the other children and afraid of physical violence. One aggressive little lesbian would pull my hair whenever she saw me. I would like to shove her face in right now, but she fell off a horse and broke her neck years ago. When at about 7, my parents decided to move to the suburbs to get away from people. They bought a large house with grounds and woods and a fish pond where there were squirrels instead of rats. They lived there in a comfortable capsule with a beautiful garden and cut off from contact with the life of the city. I went to a private suburban high school. I was not conspicuously good or bad at sports, neither brilliant nor backward in studies. I had a definite blind spot for mathematics or anything mechanical. I never liked competitive team games and avoided these whenever possible. I became, in fact, a chronic malingerer. I did like fishing, hunting, and hiking. I read more than was usual for an American boy of that time and place. Oscar Wilde, Anatole France, Baudelaire, even Gide. I formed a romantic attachment for another boy, and we spent our Saturdays exploring old quarries, riding around on bicycles, and fishing in ponds and rivers. At this time, I was greatly impressed by an autobiography of a burglar called You Can't Win. The author claimed to have spent a good part of his life in jail. It sounded good to me compared with the dullness of a Midwest suburb where all contact with life was shut out. The environment was empty, the antagonist hidden, and I drifted into solo adventures. My criminal acts were gestures, unprofitable, and for the most part unpunished. I would break into houses and walk around without taking anything. As a matter of fact, I had no need for money. Sometimes I would drive around in the country with a .22 rifle shooting chickens. I made the roads unsafe with reckless driving until an accident from which I emerged miraculously and portentously unscratched scared me into normal caution. I went to one of the big three universities where I majored in English literature for lack of interest in any other subject. I hated the university and I hated the town it was in. Everything about the place was dead. The university was a fake English setup taken over by the graduates of fake English public schools. I was lonely. I knew no one, and strangers were regarded with distaste by the closed corporation of the desirables. By accident, I met some rich homosexuals of the international queer set who cruise around the world bumping into each other in queer joints from New York to Cairo. I saw a way of life, a vocabulary, references, a whole symbol system, as the sociologists say. But these people were jerks for the most part, and after an initial period of fascination, I cooled off on the setup. When I graduated without honors, I had $150 per month in trust. That was in the Depression, and there were no jobs, and I couldn't think of any job I wanted in any case. I drifted around Europe for a year or so. Remnants of the post-war decay lingered in Europe. U.S. dollars could buy a good percentage of the inhabitants of Austria, male or female. That was in 1936, and the Nazis were closing in fast. I went back to the States. With my trust fund, I could live without working or hustling. I was still cut off from life as I had been in the Midwest suburb. I fooled around taking graduate courses in psychology and jiu-jitsu lessons. I decided to undergo psychoanalysis and continued with it for 3 years. Analysis removed inhibitions and anxiety so that I could live the way I wanted to live. Much of my progress in analysis was accomplished in spite of my analyst, who did not like my orientation, as he called it. He finally abandoned analytic objectivity and put me down as an out-and-out con. I was more pleased with the results than he was. After being rejected on physical grounds from 5 officer training programs, I was drafted into the Army and certified fit for unlimited service. I decided I was not going to like the Army and copped out on my nuthouse record. I once got on a Van Gogh kick and cut off a finger joint to impress someone who interested me at the time. The nut house doctors had never heard of Van Gogh. They put me down for schizophrenia, adding paranoid type, to explain the upsetting fact that I knew where I was and who was president of the U.S. When the Army saw that diagnosis, they discharged me with the notation, "This man is never to be recalled or reclassified." After parting company with the Army, I took a variety of jobs. You could have about any job you wanted at that time. I worked as a private detective, an exterminator, a bartender. I worked in factories and offices. I played around the edges of crime. But my $150 per month was always there. I did not have to have money. It seemed a romantic extravagance to jeopardize my freedom by some token act of crime. It was at this time and under these circumstances that I came in contact with junk, became an addict, and thereby gained the motivation, the real need for money I had never had before. The question is frequently asked, why does a man become a drug addict? The answer is that he usually does not intend to become an addict. You don't wake up one morning and decide to be a drug addict. It takes at least 3 months shooting twice a day to get any habit at all. You don't really know what junk sickness is until you have had several habits. It took me almost 6 months to get my first habit, and then the withdrawal symptoms were mild. I think it no exaggeration to say it takes about a year and several hundred injections to make an addict. The questions, of course, could be asked. Why did you ever try narcotics? Why did you continue using it long enough to become an addict? You become a narcotics addict because you do not have strong motivations in any other direction. Junk wins by default. I tried it as a matter of curiosity. I drifted along, taking shots when I could score. I ended up hooked. Most addicts I have talked to report a similar experience. They did not start using drugs for any reason they can remember. They just drifted along until they got hooked. If you have never been addicted, you can have no clear idea what it means to need junk with the addict's special need. You don't decide to be an addict. One morning you wake up sick, and you are an addict. I have never regretted my experience with drugs. I think I am in better health now as a result of using junk at intervals than I would be if I had never been an addict. Junk is a cellular equation that teaches the user facts of general validity. I've learned a great deal from using junk. I've seen life measured out in eyedroppers of morphine solution. I experienced the agonizing deprivation of junk sickness and the pleasure of relief when junk-thirsty cells drank from the needle. Perhaps all pleasure is relief. I have learned the cellular stoicism that junk teaches the user. I have seen a cell full of sick junkies, silent and immobile in separate misery. They knew the pointlessness of complaining or moving. They knew that basically no one can help anyone else. There is no key, no secret someone else has that he can give you. I've learned the junk equation. Junk is not, like alcohol or weed, a means to increased enjoyment of life. Junk is not a kick. It is a way of life. first experience with junk was during the war, about 1944 or 1945. I had made the acquaintance of a man named Norton who was working in a shipyard at the time. Norton, whose real name was Morelli or something like that, had been discharged from the peacetime army for forging a paycheck. It was classified 4F for reasons of bad character. He looked like George Rath, but was taller. Norton was trying to improve his English and achieve a smooth, affable manner. Affability, however, did not come natural to him. In repose, his expression was sullen and mean. You knew he always had that mean look when you turned your back. Norton was a hard-working thief, and he did not feel right unless he stole something every day from the shipyard where he worked. A tool, some canned goods, a pair of overalls, anything at all. One day he called me up and said he had stolen a Tommy gun. Could I find someone to buy it? I said, maybe, bring it over. The housing shortage was getting underway. I paid $15 a week for a dirty apartment that opened onto a companionway and never got any sunlight. The wallpaper was flaking off because the radiator leaked steam when there was any steam in it to leak. The place was full of roaches, and occasionally I killed a bedbug. I was sitting by the radiator, a little damp from the steam, when I heard Norton's knock. I opened the door, and there he was, standing in the dark hall, with a big parcel wrapped in brown paper under his arm. He smiled and said, "Hello." I said, "Come in, Norton, take off your coat." He unwrapped the Tommy gun, and we assembled it and snapped the firing pin. I said I would find someone to buy it. Norton said, "Oh, here's something else I picked up." It was a flat yellow box with 5 1/2-grain syrettes of morphine tartrate. "This is just a sample," he said, indicating the morphine. "I've got 15 of these boxes at home, and I can get more if you get rid of these." I said, "I'll see what I can do." At that time I had never used any junk, and it did not occur to me to try it. I began looking for someone to buy the 2 items, and that is how I ran into Roy and Herman. I knew a young hoodlum from upstate New York who was working as a short-order cook in Rikers. "Cooling off," he explained. I called him and said I had something to get rid of and made an appointment to meet him in the Angle Bar on 8th Avenue near 42nd Street. The bar was a meeting place for 42nd Street hustlers, a peculiar breed of 4-flushing would-be criminals. They're always looking for a set-up man, someone to plan jobs and tell them exactly what to do. Since no set-up man would have anything to do with people so obviously inept, unlucky, and unsuccessful, they go on looking, fabricating preposterous lies about their big scores, cooling off as dishwashers, soda jerks, waiters, occasionally rolling a drunk or a timid queer. Always looking for the set-up man with a big job who will say, "I've been watching you. You're the man I need for this setup. Now listen." Jack, through whom I met Roy and Herman, was not one of these lost sheep looking for the shepherd, with a diamond ring and a gun in the shoulder holster, and the hard, confident voice with overtones of connections, fixes, set up so it would make a stick-up sound easy and sure of success. Jack was very successful from time to time, and would turn up in new clothes and even new cars. He was also an inveterate liar, who seemed to lie more for himself than for any visible audience. He had a clean-cut, healthy country face, but there was something curiously diseased about him. He was subject to sudden fluctuations in weight, like a diabetic or a sufferer from liver trouble. These changes in weight were often accompanied by uncontrollable fits of restlessness, so that he would disappear for some days. He slid into the booth where I was sitting and ordered a shot of whiskey. He tossed it off, put the glass down, and looked at me, with his head tilted a little to one side and back. "What's this guy got?" he said. "A Tommy gun and about 35 grains of morphine. The morphine I can get rid of right away, but the Tommy gun may take a little time." Two detectives walked in and leaned on the bar, talking to the bartender. Jack jerked his head in their direction. "The law. Let's take a walk." I followed him out of the bar. "I'm taking you to someone who will want the morphine," he said. "You want to forget this address." We went down to the bottom level of the independent subway. Jack's voice, talking to his invisible audience, went on and on. No external noise drowned him out. "Give me a 38 every time. Just flick back the hammer and let her go. I'll drop anyone at 500 feet. Don't care what you say. My brother has 230 caliber machine guns stashed in Iowa." We got off the subway and began to walk on snow-covered sidewalks between tenements. This guy owed me for a long time, see. I knew he had it, but he wouldn't pay. So I waited for him when he finished work. I had a roll of nickels. No one can hang anything on you for carrying U.S. currency. Told me he was broke. I cracked his jaw and took my money off him. Two of his friends standing there, but they kept out of it. I'd have switched a blade on them. We were walking up tenement stairs. The stairs were made of worn black metal. We stopped in front of a narrow metal-covered door, and Jack gave an elaborate knock, inclining his head to the door like a safecracker. The door was opened by a large, flabby, middle-aged queer, with tattooing on his forearms and even on the backs of his hands. "This is Joey," Jack said, and Joey said, "Hello there." Jack pulled a $5 bill from his pocket and gave it to Joey. "Get us a quarter Shanleys, will you, Joey?" Joey put on an overcoat and went out. After Joey went out, I noticed another man who was standing there looking at me. Waves of hostility and suspicion flowed out from his large brown eyes like some sort of television broadcast. The effect was almost like a physical impact. The man was small and very thin, his neck loose in the collar of his shirt. His complexion faded from brown to a mottled yellow, and pancake makeup had been heavily applied in an attempt to conceal a skin eruption. His mouth was drawn down at the corners in a grimace of petulant annoyance. "Who is this?" he said. His name, I learned later, was Herman. "Friend of mine, he's got some morphine he wants to get rid of." Herman shrugged and turned out his hands. I don't think I want to bother, really. Okay, Jack said, we'll sell it to someone else. Come on, Bill. We went into the front room. There was a small radio, a china Buddha with a votive candle in front of it, pieces of bric-a-brac. A man was lying on a studio couch. He sat up as we entered the room and said hello and smiled pleasantly, showing discolored, brownish teeth. It was a southern voice with the accent of East Texas. Jack said, "Roy, this is a friend of mine. He has some morphine he wants to sell." The man sat up straighter and swung his legs off the couch. His jaw fell slackly, giving his face a vacant look. The skin of his face was smooth and brown. The cheekbones were high, and he looked oriental. His ears stuck out at right angles from his asymmetrical skull. The light in the room glinted on the points of light in his eyes, like an opal. "How much you have?" he asked me. 75 half-grain cigarettes. "The regular price is $2 a grain," he said. "But cigarettes go for a little less. People want habits. Those cigarettes have too much water and you have to squeeze the stuff out and cook it down." He paused and his face went blank. "I can go about 150 a grain," he said finally. "I guess that will be okay," I said. He asked me how we could make contact, and I gave him my phone number. Joey came back with the whiskey, and we all had a drink. Herman stuck his head in from the kitchen and said to Jack, "Could I talk to you for a minute? I can hear them arguing about something." Then Jack came back and Herman stayed in the kitchen. We all had a few drinks and Jack began telling a story. My partner was going through the joint. The guy was sleeping, and I was standing over him with a 3-foot length of pipe I found in the bathroom. The pipe had a faucet on the end of it, see? All of a sudden he comes up and jumps straight out of bed running. I let him have it with the faucet end, and he goes on running right out into the other room, the blood spurting out of his head 10 feet every time his heart beat. He made a pumping motion with his hand. You could see the brain there and the blood coming out of it. Jack began to laugh uncontrollably. My girl was waiting out in the car. She called me a cold-blooded killer. He laughed until his face was purple. A few nights after meeting Roy and Herman, I used one of the cigarettes, which was my first experience with junk. A cigarette is like a toothpaste tube with a needle on the end. You push a pin down through the needle, the pin punctures the seal, and the cigarette is ready to shoot. Morphine hits the backs of the legs first, then the back of the neck. A spreading wave of relaxation, slackening the muscles away from the bones so that you seem to float without outlines, like lying in warm salt water. As this relaxing wave spread, I experienced a strong feeling of fear. I had the feeling that some horrible image was just beyond the field of vision, moving as I turned my head so that I never quite saw it. I felt nauseous. I lay down and closed my eyes. A series of pictures passed like watching a movie. A huge neon-lighted cocktail bar that got larger and larger until streets, traffic, and street repairs were included in it. A waitress carrying a skull on a tray. stars in the clear sky, the physical impact of the fear of death, the shutting off of breath, the stopping of blood. I dozed off and woke up with a start of fear. Next morning I vomited and felt sick until noon. Roy called that night. About what we were discussing the other night, he said, I could go about $4 per box and take 5 boxes now. Are you busy? I'll come over to your place. We'll come to some kind of agreement. A few minutes later, he knocked at the door. He had on a Glen plaid suit and a dark, coffee-coated shirt. We said hello, and he looked around blankly and said, If you don't mind, I'll take one of those now. I opened the box. He took out a cigarette and injected it into his leg. He pulled up his pants briskly and took out $20. I put 5 boxes on the kitchen table. I think I'll take them out of the boxes, he said. Too bulky. He began putting the cigarettes into his coat pockets. I don't think they'll perforate this way, he said. Listen, I'll call you again in a day or so after I get rid of these and have some more money. Next day he was back. He shot another cigarette and pulled out $40. I laid out 10 boxes and kept 2. These are for me, I said. He looked at me surprised. You use it? Now and then. It's bad stuff, he said, shaking his head. The worst thing that can happen to a man. We all think we can control it at first. Sometimes we don't want to control it. He laughed. I'll take all you can get at that price. Next day he was back. He asked if I didn't want to change my mind about selling the 2 boxes. I said no. He bought 2 cigarettes for $1 each, shot them both, and left. During the next month, I used up the 8 cigarettes I had not sold. The fear I had experienced after using the first cigarette was not noticeable after the third, but still, from time to time after taking a shot, I would wake up with a start of fear. After 6 weeks or so, I gave Roy a ring. I said, Say, do you have any to sell of the material I sold you before? There was a pause. Yes, he said, I can let you have 6, but the price will have to be $3 per. You understand, I don't have many. Okay, I said, you know the way. Bring it on over. It was 12 1/2-grain tablets in a thin glass tube. I paid him $18, and he apologized again for the retail rate. Next day, he bought 2 grains back. It's mighty hard to get now at any price, he said, looking for a vein in his leg and shot the liquid in. Later that day, Roy pointed out to me a drugstore where they sold needles without any questions. Very few drugstores will sell them without a prescription. He showed me how to make a collar out of paper to fit the needle to an eyedropper. An eyedropper is easier to use than a regular hypo, especially for giving yourself vein shots. Several days later, Roy sent me to see a doctor with a story about kidney stones to hit him for a morphine prescription. The doctor's wife slammed the door in my face, but Roy finally got past her and made the doctor for a 10-grain script. The doctor's office was in junk territory on 102nd Street off Broadway. He was a doddering old man and could not resist the junkies who filled his office and were, in fact, his only patients. It seemed to give him a feeling of importance, to look out and see an office full of people. Roy shipped out at 2 or 3 week intervals. His trips were Army transport and generally short. When he was in town, we generally split a few scripts. The old croaker on 102nd finally lost his mind altogether, and no drugstore would fill his scripts. But Roy located an Italian doctor out in the Bronx who would write. I was taking a shot from time to time, but I was a long way from having a habit. At this time, I moved into an apartment on the Lower East Side. It was a tenement apartment with a front door opening into the kitchen. One day, Herman told me about a kilo of first-class New Orleans weed I could pick up for $70. Bushing weed looks good on paper, like fur farming or raising frogs. At 75 cents a stick, 70 sticks to the ounce, it sounded like money. I was convinced and bought the weed. Herman and I formed a partnership to push the weed. We located a lesbian named Marion, who lived in the village and said she was a poetess. We kept the weed in Marion's apartment, turned her on for all she could use, and gave her 50% on sales. But she knew a lot of tea-heads. Another lesbian moved in with her, and every time I went to Marion's apartment, there was this huge red-haired Lizzie watching me with her cold fish eyes full of stupid hate. One day, the red-haired Lizzie opened the door and stood there, her face dead white and puffy with Nematol sleep. She shoved the package of weed at me. "Take this and get out," she said. "You're both motherfuckers." She was half asleep. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if referring to actual incest. I said, "Tell Marion thanks for everything." She slammed the door. The noise evidently woke her up. She opened the door again and began screaming with hysterical rage. We could still hear her out on the street. Herman contacted other tea-heads. They all gave us static. In practice, pushing weed is a headache. To begin with, weed is bulky. You need a full suitcase to realize any money. If the cops start kicking your door in, it's like being with a bale of alfalfa. Tea-heads are not like junkies. A junkie hands you the money, takes his junk and cuts. But tea-heads don't do things that way. They expect the peddler to light them up and sit around talking for half an hour to sell $2 worth of weed. If you come right to the point, they say you're a bring-down. In fact, a peddler should not come right out and say he is a peddler. No, he just scores for a few good cats and chicks because he is viperish. Everyone knows that he himself is the connection, but it is bad form to say so. God knows why. To me, tea-heads are unfathomable. I soon found out I couldn't get along with these characters, and I was glad to find someone to take the tea off my hands at cost. I decided right then I would never push any more tea. In 1937, weed was placed under the Harrison Narcotics Act. Narcotics authorities claim it is a habit-forming drug, that its use is injurious to mind and body, and that it causes the people who use it to commit crimes. Here are the facts. Weed is positively not habit-forming. You can smoke weed for years, and you will experience no discomfort if your supply is suddenly cut off. I have seen T-heads in jail, and none of them showed withdrawal symptoms. I smoked weed myself, off and on, for 15 years, and never missed it when I ran out. There is less habit to weed than there is to tobacco. Weed does not harm the general health. In fact, most users claim it gives you an appetite and acts as a tonic to the system. I was shooting every day now. Herman had moved into my apartment on Henry Street. It would not have occurred to Herman to pay rent himself. He had lived in other people's apartments all his life. Roy was giving himself a long shore leave. He located a doctor in Brooklyn who was a writing fool. This croaker would go 3 scripts a day for as high as 30 tablets a script. Every now and then he would get dubious on the deal, but the sight of money always straightened him out. There are several varieties of writing croakers. Some will write only if they are convinced you are an addict. Others only if they are convinced you are not. Most addicts put down a story worn smooth by years of use. Some claim gallstones or kidney stones. This is the story most generally used, and a croaker will often get up and open the door as soon as you mention gallstones. I got better results with facial neuralgia once I looked up the symptoms and committed them to memory. Roy had an operation scar on his stomach that he used to support his gallstone routine. There was one old-time doctor who lived in a Victorian brownstone in the West 70s. With him, it was simply necessary to present a gentlemanly front. If you could get into his inner office, you had it made. But he would write only 3 prescriptions. Another doctor was always drunk, and it was a matter of catching him at the right time. Often he wrote the prescription wrong, and you had to take it back for correction. Then, like as not, he would say the prescription was a forgery and tear it up. Still another doctor was senile, and you had to help him write the script. He would forget what he was doing, put down the pen, and go into a long reminiscence about the high class of patients he used to have. Especially he liked to talk about a man named General Gore, who once said to him, "Doctor, I've been to the Mayo Clinic, and you know more medicine than the whole clinic put together." There was no stopping him, and the exasperated addict was forced to listen patiently. Generally speaking, old doctors are more apt to write than the young ones. Refugee doctors were a good field for a while, but the addicts burned them down. Often a doctor will blow his top at the mention of narcotics and threaten to call the law. Roy was such a junk hog that Herman and I had to shoot more than we needed to keep up with him and get our share. I began shooting in the main line to save stuff, and because the immediate kick was better. We were having trouble filling the scripts. Most drugstores will only fill a morphine script once or twice. Many, not at all. There was one drugstore that would fill all our scripts anytime, and we took them all there, though Roy said we ought to spread them out so they would be harder for the inspector to find. It was too much trouble to walk around from drugstore to drugstore, so we usually ended up taking them to the same place. I was learning to hide my stuff carefully, stash it, as they say in the trade, so Roy and Herman couldn't find it and take some. Taking junk hidden by another junkie is known as making him for his stash. It's difficult to guard against this form of theft because junkies know where to look for a stash. Some people carry their junk around with them, but a man who does that is subject to a charge of possession in the event of search by the law. As I began using stuff every day, or often several times a day, I stopped drinking and going out at night. When you use junk, you don't drink. Seemingly, the body that has a quantity of junk in its cells will not absorb alcohol. The liquor stays in the stomach, slowly building up nausea, discomfort, dizziness, and there is no kick. Using junk would be a sure cure for alcoholics. I also stopped bathing. When you use junk, the feel of water on the skin is unpleasant for some reason, and junkies are reluctant to take a bath. A lot of nonsense has been written about the changes people undergo as they get a habit. All of a sudden, the addict looks in the mirror and does not recognize himself. The actual changes are difficult to specify, and they do not show up in the mirror. That is, the addict himself has a special blind spot as far as the progress of his habit is concerned. He generally does not realize that he is getting a habit at all. He says there's no need to get a habit if you're careful and observe a few rules like shooting every other day. Actually, he does not observe these rules, but every extra shot is regarded as exceptional. I have talked to many addicts, and they all say they were surprised when they discovered they actually had the first habit. Many of them attributed their symptoms to some other cause. As the habit takes hold, life telescopes down to junk. One fix and looking forward to the next. Stashes and scripts, spikes and droppers. The addict himself often feels that he is leading a normal life, and the junk is incidental. He does not realize that he is just going through the motions in his non-junk activities. It is not until his supply is cut off that he realizes what junk means to him. Why do you need narcotics, Mr. Lee? Is a question that stupid psychiatrists ask. The answer is, I need junk to get out of bed in the morning, to shave and eat breakfast. I need it to stay alive. All croakers pack in sooner or later. One day when Roy came for his script, the doctor told him, "Now this is positively the last, and you guys had better keep out of sight. The inspector was around to see me yesterday. He has all the RXs I wrote for you guys. He told me I'll lose my license if I write any more. So I'm going to date this one back. Tell the druggist you were too sick yesterday to cash it. You guys gave some wrong addresses on those scripts, and that's a violation of Public Health Law 334. So don't say I didn't warn you." For God's sakes, cover up for me if they question you. This could mean my whole professional career. You know I've always been right with you boys. I wanted to stop months ago. I just couldn't leave you guys stranded. So give me a break. Here's the script, and don't come back. Our croaker had packed in. We split up to comb the city. We covered Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, Jersey City, and Newark. We couldn't even score for Pentagon. It seemed like the doctors were all expecting us, just waiting for us to walk into the office so they could say absolutely no. It was as though every doctor in greater New York had suddenly taken a pledge never to write another narcotic script. We were running out of junk. Patently, we would be immobilized in a matter of hours. Roy decided to throw in the towel and go to Rikers Island for the 30-day cure. This is not a reduction cure. They don't give any junk, not even a sleeping tablet. All they offer the addict is 30 days detention. The place is always full. Herman got picked up in the Bronx while he was looking for a croaker. No definite charge, just two detectives didn't like his looks. When they got him downtown, they found out the narcotics squad had a warrant for him sworn out by the state inspector. The charge was wrong address on a narcotics script. Some wagon-chasing lawyer called me up and asked if I could put up the money to buy Herman a bond. I sent $2 for cigarettes instead. If a man's going to do time, he might as well start doing it. I was all out of junk at this point and had double-boiled my last cottons. Junk is cooked up in a spoon and sucked into the dropper through a little piece of cotton to get it all out of the spoon. Some of the solution stays in the cotton, and addicts save their cottons for emergencies. When I heard one day that Herman had been arrested, I figured I would be next. But I was already sick and did not have the energy to leave town. I was arrested at my apartment by two detectives and a federal agent. The state inspector had sworn out a warrant charging me with a violation of Public Health Law 334 for giving a wrong name on a prescription. The two detectives were the con man and tough guy team. The con man was asking me, "How long you been using junk, Bill? You know you ought to give a right name on those scripts." Then the tough guy would break in. Come on, we're not Boy Scouts." But they were not much interested in the case, and a statement from me was not necessary. I was taken to the tombs, mugged and fingerprinted. While I was waiting to go before the judge, the con man gave me a cigarette and began telling me what a bad deal junk is. "Even if you get by with it 30 years, you're only kidding yourself. Now you take those sex degenerates." His eyes glistened. "The doctors say they can't help themselves." The judge set bail at $1,000. I was taken back to the tombs, ordered to take off my clothes and get under the shower. An apathetic guard poked through my clothes. I got dressed again, went up in the elevator, and was assigned to a cell. The last of the codeine was running out. My nose and eyes began to run. Sweat soaked through my clothes. Hot and cold flashes hit me as though a furnace door was swinging open and shut. I lay down on the bunk, too weak to move. My legs ached and twitched so that any position was intolerable. and I moved from one side to the other, sloshing about in my sweaty clothes. A negro voice was singing, get up, woman, off your big, fat, rusty-dusty." Voices drifted back and forth. 40 years, man, I can't do no 40 years. At 12 that night, my old lady bailed me out and met me at the door with some goofballs. Goofballs help a little. Next day I was worse and could not get out of bed, so I stayed in bed taking Nambies at intervals. At night I would take 2 strips of Benzedrine and go out to a bar where I sat right by the jukebox. When you're sick, music is a great help. Once in Texas, I kicked a habit on weed, a pint of paregoric, and a few Louis Armstrong records. Almost worse than the sickness is the depression that goes with it. One afternoon I closed my eyes and saw New York in ruins. Huge centipedes and scorpions crawled in and out of empty bars and cafeterias and drugstores on 42nd Street. Weeds were going up through cracks and holes in the pavement. There was no one in sight. After 5 days, I began to feel a little better. After 8 days, I got the chucks and developed a tremendous appetite for cream puffs and macaroons. In 10 days, the sickness had gone. My case had been postponed. Roy came back from his 30-day cure on Rikers Island and introduced me to a peddler who was pushing Mexican H on 103rd and Broadway. During the early part of the war, imports of H were virtually cut off, and the only junk available was prescription M. However, lines of communication reformed, and heroin began coming in from Mexico, where there were poppy fields tended by Chinese. 103rd is a subway stop, a crowded block. This is junk territory. Junk haunts the cafeteria, roams up and down the block, sometimes half crossing Broadway to rest on one of the island benches. A ghost in daylight on a crowded street. You could always find a few junkies sitting in the cafeteria or standing around outside with coat collars turned up, spitting on the sidewalk and looking up and down the street as they waited for the connection. In summer, they sit on the island benches, huddled like so many vultures in their dark suits. The hipster bebop junkies never showed at 103rd Street. The 103rd Street boys were all old-timers. Thin, sallow faces, bitter, twisted mouths, stiff-fingered, stylized gestures. There is a junk gesture that marks the junkie like the limp wrist marks the fag. The hand swings out from the elbow, stiff-fingered, palm up. They were of various nationalities and physical types, but they all looked alike somehow. They all looked like junk. There was Irish, George the Greek, Pentapon Rose, Louis the Bellhop, Eric the Fag, the Beagle, the Sailor, and Joe the Mex. Several of them are dead now, others are doing time. Joe the Mex had a thin face with a long, sharp, twitchy nose and a down-curving, toothless mouth. Joe's face was lined and ravaged, but not old. Things had happened to his face, but Joe was not touched. His eyes were bright and young. There was a gentleness about him, common to many old-time junkies. You could spot Joe blocks away. In the anonymous city crowd, he stood out sharp and clear, as though you were seeing him through binoculars. He was a liar, and like most liars, he was constantly changing his stories, altering time and personnel from one telling to the next. Louis was a shoplifter who had lost what nerve he ever had. He wore long, shabby black overcoats that gave him the look of a furtive buzzard. Thief and junkie stuck out all over him. And Louis had a hard time making it. I heard that at one time he had been a stool pigeon, but at the time I knew him, he was generally considered right. George the Greek did not like Louis and said he was just a bum. Don't ever invite him to your home. He'll take advantage. He'll go on the nod in front of your family. He's got no class to him. George the Greek was the admitted arbiter of this set. He decided who was right and who was wrong. George prided himself on his integrity. I never beat nobody. George was a 3-time loser. The next time meant life as an habitual criminal. His life narrowed down to the necessity of avoiding any serious involvements. No pushing, no stealing. He worked from time to time on the docks. He was hemmed in on every side, and there was no way for him to go but down. When he couldn't get junk, which was about half the time, he drank and took goopballs. The fag was a brilliantly successful lush worker. His scores were fabulous. He was the man who gets to a lush first, never the man who arrives on the scene when the lush is lying there with his pockets turned inside out. A sleeping lush, known as a flop in the trade, attracts a hierarchy of scavengers. First come the top lush workers like the fag, guided by a special radar. They only want cash, good rings, and watches. Then come the punks who will steal anything. They take the hat, shoes, and belt. Finally, brazen, clumsy thieves will try to pull the lush's overcoat or jacket off him. The fag was always first on a good lush. One time he scored for $1,000 at the 103rd Street station. Often his scores ran into the hundreds. If the lush woke up, he would simper and feel the man's thigh, as though his intentions were sexual. From this angle, he got his moniker. He always dressed well, usually in tweed sport coats and gray flannels. A European charm of manner and a slight Scandinavian accent completed his front. No one could have looked less like a lush roller. He always worked alone. The H-caps cost $3 each, and you need at least 3 a day to get by. I was short, so I began working the hole with Roy. We would ride along, each looking out one side of the subway car until one of us spotted a flop sleeping on a bench. Then we would get off the train. I stood in front of the bench with a newspaper and covered Roy while he went through the lusher's pockets. Roy would whisper instructions to me. A little left, too far, a little back. There, hold it there. And I would move to keep him covered. Often we were late, and the lush would be lying there with his pockets turned inside out. We also worked on the cars. I would sit down next to the lush and open the newspaper. Roy would reach across my back and go through the lush's pockets. If the lush woke up, he could see that I had both hands on the paper. An average night went more or less like this. We started work about 11 o'clock, getting on the uptown IRT at Times Square. At 116th, we spotted one and got off, but the flop got up and walked away before we could get near him. The shabby man with a wide, loose mouth accosted Roy and started talking. He was another lush worker. The fag scored again, he said. 2 notes and a wristwatch down at 96th Street. Roy muttered something and looked at his paper. The man went on talking in a loud voice. I had one come up on me. What are you doing with your hand in my pocket, he says. For Christ's sake, don't talk like that, Roy said, and walked away from him. Fucking wrong, bastard. There aren't many lush workers around now. Only the fag, the beagle, and that tramp. They all envy the fag because he makes good scores. If a sucker comes up on him, he pretends to feel his leg like he was a fag. Those tramps on 103rd Street go around saying, goddamn fag, because they can't score. He's no more a fag than I am. Roy paused reflectively. Not as much, in fact. One night we got on the subway at Times Square. A flashily dressed man, weaving slightly, was walking ahead of us. Roy looked him over and said, That's a good fucking mooch. Let's see where he goes. The mooch got on the IRT, headed for Brooklyn. We waited, standing up in the space between cars, until the mooch appeared to be sleeping. Then we walked into the car, and I sat down beside the mooch, opening the New York Times. The Times was Roy's idea. He said it made me look like a businessman. The car was almost empty, and there we were, wedged up against the mooch with 20 feet of empty seats available. Roy began working over my back. The mooch kept stirring, and once he woke up and looked at me with bleary annoyance. Let's get off, I said. No, this is a good mooch. He's sitting on his overcoat, and I can't get into his pocket. When I tell you, fall up against him, and I'll move the coat at the same time. Now, for Christ's sake, that wasn't near hard enough. Let's get off, I said. I could feel fear stirring in my stomach. He's going to wake up. No, let's go again. Now, what in hell is wrong with you? Just let yourself flop against him hard. Roy, I said, for Christ's sakes, let's get off. He's going to wake up. I started to get up, but Roy held me down. Suddenly he gave me a sharp push, and I fell heavily against the mooch. Got it that time, Roy said. The poke? No, I got the coat out of the way. The mooch was only half asleep. I expected him to jump up and yell at any minute. Finally, I heard Roy say, I got it. Let's go, then. No, what I got is a loose roll. He's got a poke somewhere, and I'm going to find it. He's got to have a poke. I'm getting off. No, wait. I could feel him bumbling across my back so openly that it seemed incredible that the man could go on sleeping. It was the end of the line. Roy stood up. Cover me, he said. I stood in front of him with the paper, shielding him as much as possible from the other passengers. There were only 3 left, but they were in different ends of the car. Roy went through the man's pockets openly and crudely. Let's go outside, he said. We went out on the platform. The mooch woke up and put his hand in his pocket. All right, Jack, he said. Give me my money. Roy shrugged and turned his hands out, palm up. What money? What are you talking about? You know goddamn well what I'm talking about. You had your hand in my pocket. Roy held his hands out again in a gesture of puzzlement and deprecation. Oh, what are you talking about? I don't know anything about your money. I've seen you on this line every night. This is your regular route. He turned and pointed to me. And there's your partner right there. Now are you going to give me my dough? What dough? Okay, just stay put. We're taking a ride back to town, and this had better be good. Suddenly the man put both hands in Roy's coat pockets. You son of a bitch, he yelled, give me my dough. Roy hit him in the face and knocked him down. Why, you, said Roy, dropping abruptly his conciliatory and puzzled manner. Keep your hands off me. The conductor, seeing a fight in progress, was holding up the train so that no one would fall on the tracks. Let's cut, I said. We started down the platform. The man got up and ran after us. He threw his arms around Roy, holding on stubbornly. Roy couldn't break loose. He was pretty well winded. Get this mooch off me! I hit the man twice in the face. His grip loosened, and he fell to his knees. Kick his head off, said Roy. I kicked the man in the side and felt a rib snap. The man put his hand to his side. Help! He shouted. He did not try to get up. Let's cut, I said. At the far end of the platform, I heard a police whistle. The man was still lying there on the platform, holding his side and yelling, help, at regular intervals. There was a slight drizzle of rain falling. When I hit the street, I slipped and skidded on the wet sidewalk. We were standing by a closed filling station, looking back at the elevated. Let's go, I said. They'll see us. We can't stay here. We started to walk. There's sure to be an alarm out for us, Roy said. Keep a lookout for cars. We'll duck in the bushes if any come along. They'll be figuring us to get back on the subway, so the best thing we can do is keep walking. The drizzle continued. Dogs barked at us as we walked. Remember our story if we get nailed, Roy said. We fell asleep and woke up at the end of the line. This guy accused us of taking his money. We were scared, so we knocked him down and ran. They'll beat the shit out of us. You have to expect that. Here comes a car, I said. Yellow lights, too. We crawled into the bushes at the side of the road and crouched down behind a signboard. The car drove slowly by. We started walking again. I was getting sick, and I wondered if I would get home to the MS I had stashed in my apartment. We finally ran into the BMT line and rode back to Manhattan. My case came to trial in special sessions. I drew a 4-month suspended sentence. After I gave up lush working, I decided to push junk. There isn't much money in it. About all a street peddler addict can expect to do is keep up his habit. But at least when you're pushing, you have a good supply of junk on hand, and that gives a feeling of security. Of course, some people do make money pushing. I knew an Irish pusher who started out capping a 1/16 ounce envelope of H, and 2 years later, when he took a fall and went away for 3 years, he had $30,000 and an apartment building in Brooklyn. If you want to push, the first step is to find a wholesale connection. I did not have a connection, so I formed a partnership with Bill Gaines, who had a pretty fair Italian connection on the Lower East Side. We bought the stuff for $90 per quarter ounce, cut it 1/3 with milk sugar, and put it in 1-grain caps. Bill Gaines came from a good family. As I recall, his father had been a bank president somewhere in Maryland, and he had front. Gaines's routine was stealing overcoats out of restaurants, and he was perfectly adapted to this work. The American upper-middle-class citizen is a composite of negatives. He is largely delineated by what he is not. Gaines went further. He was not merely negative, he was positively invisible. A vague, respectable presence. There is a certain kind of ghost that can only materialize with the aid of a sheet or other piece of cloth to give it outline. Gaines was like that. He materialized in someone else's overcoat. Gaines had a malicious, childlike smile that formed a shocking contrast to his eyes, which were pale blue, lifeless, and old. He smiled, listening down into himself, as if attending to something there that pleased him. Sometimes after a shot, he would smile and listen and say slyly, "This stuff is powerful." With the same smile, he would report on the deterioration and misfortunes of others. Herman was a beautiful kid when he first came to New York. The trouble is, he lost his looks. Gaines was one of the few junkies who really took a special pleasure in seeing non-users get a habit. Many junk pushers are glad to see a new addict for economic reasons. If you have a commodity, you naturally want customers, provided they are the right kind. But Gaines liked to invite young kids up to his room and give them a shot, usually compounded of old cottons, and then watch the effects, smiling his little smile. Mostly the kids said it was a good kick, and that was all. Just another kick like Nemmies or Bennies or Lush or Weed. But a few stayed around to get hooked, and Gaines would look at these converts and smile, a prelate of junk. A little later you would hear him say, "Really, so-and-so must realize that I can't carry him any longer." The pledge was no longer being rushed. It was time for him to pay off, and pay off for the rest of his life, waiting on street corners and in cafeterias for the connection, the mediator between man and junk. Gaines was a mere parish priest in the hierarchy of junk. He would speak of the higher-ups in a voice of sepulchral awe. The connections, say. One of my first customers was a village character named Nick. Nick painted when he did anything. His canvases were very small and looked as if they had been concentrated, compressed, misshapen by a tremendous pressure. The product of a depraved mind, a narcotics agent pronounced solemnly after viewing one of Nick's pictures. Nick was always half sick, his large, plaintive brown eyes watering slightly and his thin nose running. He slept on couches in the apartments of friends, existing on the precarious indulgence of neurotic, unstable, stupidly suspicious individuals who would suddenly throw him out without reason or warning. For these people he also scored, hoping that he would receive in return at least the head off the cap to take the edge off his constant junk hunger. Often he got nothing but a casual thanks, the purchaser having convinced himself that Nick had somehow got his on the other end. As a result, Nick began stealing a small amount from each cap, loosening up the junk so that it filled the cap. There was not much left of Nick. His constant, unsatisfied hunger had burned out all other concerns. He talked vaguely about going to Lexington for the cure, or shipping out in the merchant marine, or buying paregoric in Connecticut and tapering off on it. Nick introduced me to Tony, who tended bar in a village bar and restaurant. Tony had been pushing and nearly got nailed when the Federals rushed into his apartment. He barely had time to throw a 1/16-ounce packet of H under the piano. The Federals found nothing but his works, and they let him go. Tony was scared and quit pushing. He was a young Italian who obviously knew his way around. He looked capable of keeping his mouth shut. A good type customer. I went to Tony's bar every day and ordered a Coca-Cola. Tony would tell me how many caps he wanted, and I would go into the phone booth of the WC and wrap his caps up in silver paper. When I got back to my Coke, the money for the caps was there on the bar like change. I dropped the caps into an ashtray on the bar, and Tony emptied the ashtray under the bar, taking out his caps. This bar where Tony worked was a small place down several steps from street level. There was only one door. I always felt trapped when I went in there. The place gave me such a feeling of depression and danger that I could hardly bring myself to go through the door. After taking care of Tony and Ray, I generally met Nick in a cafeteria on 6th Avenue. He always had the price of a few caps on him. I knew, of course, that he was scoring for other people, but I did not know who they were. I should have known better than to have dealings with anybody like Nick, who was sick and broke all the time and therefore liable to pick up anybody's money. I was not in a position to turn money down. I had no margin. Every day I had to sell enough caps to buy the next quarter ounce, and I was never more than a few dollars ahead. So I took whatever money Nick had and asked no questions. I went into pushing with Bill Gaines, who handled the uptown business. I met Bill in an 8th Avenue cafeteria after I finished up in the village. He had a few good customers. Izzy, probably his best, had a job as a cook on a tugboat in New York Harbor. He was one of the 103rd Street boys. Izzy had done time for pushing, was known as a thoroughly right guy, and he had a steady source of income. This is a perfect customer. When I arrived at the cafeteria where we had our meet, there was Bill sitting at a table, his skinny frame huddled in someone else's overcoat. After Bill got his shot, a little color crept into his face, and he would become almost coy. It was a gruesome sight. I remember once he told me how he'd been propositioned by a queer who offered him $20. Bill declined, saying, I don't think you would be very well satisfied. Bill twitched his fleshless hips. You should see me in the nude, he said. I'm really cute. One of Bill's most distasteful conversation routines consisted of detailed bulletins on the state of his bowels. Sometimes it gets so I have to reach my fingers in and pull it out. Hard as porcelain, you understand. The pain is terrible. Listen, I said, this connection keeps giving us a short count. I only got 80 caps out of the last batch after it was cut. Well, you can't expect too much. If I could go to a hospital and get a good enema, but they won't do a thing for you unless you check into the hospital. And of course I can't do that. They keep you at least 24 hours. I told them, you're supposed to be a hospital. I'm in pain and I need treatment. Why can't you just call an attendant and... There was no stopping him. When people start talking about their bowel movements, they are as inexorable as the processes of which they speak. Things went on like this for several weeks. One by one, Nick's contacts located me. They were tired of scoring through Nick and having him steal the head off their caps. What a crew, mooches, fags, four-flushes, stool pigeons, bums, unwilling to work, unable to steal, always short of money, always whining for credit. In the whole lot, there was not one who wouldn't wilt and spill as soon as someone belted him in the mouth and said, "Where'd you get it?" The worst of the lot was Gene Dooley, a scrawny little Irishman with a manner between fag and pimp. Gene was informer to the bone. He probably pulled out dirty lists of people, his hands were always dirty, and read them off to the law. You could see him bustling into Black and Tan headquarters during the Irish trouble, in a dirty gray toga turning in Christians, giving information to the Gestapo, the GPU, sitting in a cafeteria talking to a narcotics agent. Always the same thin, ratty face, shabby, out-of-date clothes, whiny, penetrating voice. The most unbearable thing about Gene was his voice. It went all through you. This voice was my first knowledge of his existence. Nick had just arrived at my apartment with some score money when I was called to the hall phone by the buzzer. "I'm Gene Dooley," said the voice. "I'm waiting for Nick, and I've been waiting a long time." His voice went up on long time to a shrill, grating whine. I said, "Well, he's here now, and I expect you will see him directly," and hung up. Next day, Dooley called me again. "I'm just around the corner from your place. Do you mind if I come on over? It's cooler for me to meet you alone." He hung up before I could say anything, and 10 minutes later he was standing in the door. When one personality meets another for the first time, there is a period of mutual examination on the intuitive level of empathy and identification. But it was impossible to relate oneself to Dooley in any way. He was simply the focal point for a hostile, intrusive force. You could feel him walk right into your psyche and look around to see if anything was there he could make use of. I stepped back a little from the door to avoid contact with him. He squeezed himself into the room and immediately sat down on the couch and lit a cigarette. "It's better to meet alone like this." His smile was ambiguously sexual. Nick is a very uncool guy. He stood up and handed me $4. "Do you mind if I take off here?" he asked, pulling off his coat. I had never heard anyone else use this expression. For an insane moment I thought he was making advances. He dropped his coat on the couch and rolled up his sleeve. I brought him 2 caps and a glass of water. He had his own works for which I was grateful. "Let me tell you something," he said. "You're making a big mistake to trust Nick. A few nights ago I was in Thompson's cafeteria and I ran into Rogers, the agent. He told me, 'I know Nick is scoring for all you goddamn junkies here in the village. You're getting good stuff, too, between 16 and 20%. Well, you can tell Nick this. We can take him any time we want. And when we do catch up to him, he's going to work with us. He opened up for me once. He'll do it again. We're going to find out where this stuff is coming from." Dooley looked at me and sucked on his cigarette. "When they get Nick, they'll get you. You'd better let Nick know that if he talks, you'll have him poured into a barrel of concrete and dumped in the East River. I don't need to tell you any more. You can see what the situation is." He looked at me, trying to gauge the effect of his words. It was impossible to tell just how much of this story I was expected to believe. Perhaps it was just a roundabout way of saying, how will you ever know who fingered you? With Nick such an obvious suspect, if I talked, you could never be sure, could you now? "Could you let me have 1 cap on credit?" he asked. "What I've just told you should be worth something." I gave him a cap, and he pocketed it without comment. He stood up. "Well, I'll be seeing you. I'll call at the same time tomorrow." I put out a grapevine to see what I could find out about Dooley and to check his story. No one knew anything definite about him. Tony, the bartender, said, "Dooley will think if he has to," but he couldn't give me a definite instance. Dooley came around every day, impudent, demanding, insufferable. Usually had some new bulletin on the Nick Rogers situation. He didn't mind letting me know that he was in constant touch with Rogers. On top of this, I was just barely scraping by. The short counts we kept getting from the wholesaler, the constant nibbles of credit, and customers coming up 25, 50, or even $1 short, plus my own habit. Cut profits to bare subsistence. When I complained about the wholesaler, Bill Gaines got snappish and said I ought to cut the stuff more. "You're giving a better cap than anybody in New York City. Nobody sells 16% stuff on the street. If your customers don't like it, they can take their business to Walgreens." Tony's bar still gave me the horrors. One day it was raining very hard, and I was on my way to Tony's about a half-hour late. Ray, the young Italian hipster, stuck his head out of the door of a restaurant and called me over. It was a lunch counter with booths along one wall. We sat down at a booth, and I ordered tea. "There's an agent outside in a white trench coat," Ray told me. "He followed me over here from Tony's, and I'm afraid to go out." I drank my cup of tea, thanked him for the information, and left ahead of him. I had the stuff in a package of cigarettes and was ready to throw it in the water-filled gutter. Sure enough, there was a burly young man in a white trench coat standing in a doorway. When he saw me, he started sauntering up the street ahead of me. Then he turned a corner, waiting for me to walk past so he could fall in behind. I turned and ran back in the opposite direction. When I reached 6th Avenue, he was about 50 feet behind me. I vaulted the subway turnstile and shoved the cigarette package into the space at the side of a gum machine. I ran down one level and got a train up to the square. After that, things got worse and worse. One day, the hotel clerk stopped me in the lobby. "I don't know how to say this," he said, "but there's something wrong about the people who come up to your room. I used to be in illegitimate business myself years ago. I just wanted to warn you to be careful and tell these people to watch what they say." I could feel the pedals moving steadily closer. It was a question of time. I did not trust any of the village customers, and I was convinced that at least one of them was a rank stool pigeon. Dooley was my number one suspect, with Nick running a very close second. Narcotics agents operate largely with the aid of informers. The usual routine is to grab someone with junk on him and let him stew in jail until he is good and sick. Then comes the spiel. "We can get you 5 years for possession. On the other hand, you can walk out of here right now. The decision is up to you. If you work with us, we can give you a good deal. For one thing, you'll have plenty of junk and pocket money. That is, if you deliver. Take a few minutes to think it over." The agent takes out a few caps and puts them on the table. This is like pouring a glass of ice water in front of a man dying of thirst. Why don't you pick them up? Now you're being sensible. The first man we want to get is... Some of them don't need to be pressured. Junk and pocket money is all they want, and they don't care how they get it. Sooner or later, the peddlers get wise to a pigeon, and the pigeon can't score. Where this happens, his usefulness to the agents is at an end, and they usually turn him in. Often he ends up doing more time than anybody he sent up. After the hotel clerk spoke to me, I moved to another hotel and registered under another name. I stopped going to the village and shifted all the village customers to uptown meets. When I told Gaines what the hotel clerk said to me, and how lucky we were he happened to be a right guy, he said, "We've got to pack in. We can't last with this crowd." So Bill left for Lexington, and I started for Texas in my car. I had 1/16 ounce of junk with me. I figured this was enough to taper off, and I had a reduction schedule carefully worked out. It was supposed to take 12 days. I had the junk in solution and in another bottle distilled water. Every time I took a dropper of solution out to use it, I put the same amount of distilled water in the junk solution bottle. Eventually, I would be shooting plain water. 4 days later in Cincinnati, I was out of junk and immobilized. I have never known one of these self-administered reduction cures to work. You find reasons to make each shot an exception that calls for a little extra junk. Finally, the junk is all gone and you still have your habit. I left the car in storage and took a train to Lexington. I did not have the papers that are required for admittance, but I was relying on my Army discharge to get me in. When I got to Lexington, I took a taxi out to the hospital, several miles from the town. We reached the gatehouse of the hospital. In the gatehouse was an old Irish guard. He looked at my Army discharge. "Are you addicted to the use of habit-forming drugs?" I said yes. "Well, sit down." He pointed to a bench. "You ever been here before?" he asked. I said no. "Have you got any drugs or needles or droppers on your person?" "You can surrender them here, but if you take them up to the main building, you are liable to prosecution for introducing contraband articles into a government reservation." "I've got nothing." A guard took me to my ward. "If you want to get off drugs," he said, "this is the place to do it." The ward attendant asked me if I really wanted to get off drugs. I said yes. He assigned me to a private room. About 15 minutes later, the attendant called, "Shot line." Everyone in the ward lined up. As our names were called, we put an arm through a window in the door of the ward dispensary, and the attendant gave the shots. Sick as I was, the shot fixed me. Right away, I began to get hungry. There were 3 shots a day, one at 7 a.m. when we got up, one at 1 p.m., and one at 9 p.m. 2 old acquaintances had come in during the afternoon, Matty and Lewis. I ran into Lewis as we were lining up for the evening shot. "Did they get you?" he asked me. "No, just here for the cure." How about you?" "Same with me," he answered. With the evening shot, they gave me some coral hydrate in a glass. 5 new arrivals were brought to the ward during the night. The ward attendant threw up his hands. "I don't know where I'm going to put them. I've got 31 dope fiends in here now." Among the new arrivals was a dignified, white-haired man of 70 named Bob Riordan, an old-time con man, junk pusher, and pickpocket. He looked the way bankers looked around 1910. He had come with 2 friends in a car. On the way to Lexington, they had called the Surgeon General in Washington and asked him to wire ahead to the gate that they were coming and should be let right in. They referred to the Surgeon General as Felix and seemed to know him from way back. Only Riordan got in that night. The other 2 drove to a town near Lexington where they knew a croaker to get fixed before they were immobilized for lack of junk. The cure at Lexington is not designed to keep the addicts comfortable. It starts at 1/4 grain of morphine 3 times a day and lasts 8 days. The preparation now used is a synthetic morphine called dolafine. After 8 days, you get a send-off shot and go over in population. There you receive barbiturates for 3 nights, and this is the end of medication. For a man with a heavy habit, this is a very rough schedule. I was lucky in that I came in sick, so the amount given in the cure was sufficient to fix me. The sicker you are, and the longer you have been without junk, the smaller the amount necessary to fix you. When the time came for my send-off shot, I was assigned to Ward B, Skid Row it was called. There was nothing wrong with the accommodations, but the inmates were a sorry-looking lot. In my section, there were a bunch of old bums with the spit running out of their mouths. You're allowed 7 days to rest in population after medication stops. You don't kick your habit in the shooting gallery, an inmate told me. You kick it over here in population. The night medication stopped, I checked out still sick. On a cold, windy afternoon, 5 of us took a cab into Lexington. Eventually, I got to Texas and stayed off junk for about 4 months. Then I went to New Orleans. New Orleans presents a stratified series of ruins. Along Bourbon Street are ruins of the 1920s. Down where the French Quarter blends into Skid Row are ruins of an earlier stratum. Chili joints, decaying hotels, old-time saloons with mahogany bars, spittoons, and crystal chandeliers, the ruins of 1900. There are people in New Orleans who have never been outside the city limits. The New Orleans accent is exactly similar to the accent of Brooklyn. The French Quarter is always crowded. Tourists, servicemen, merchant seamen, gamblers, perverts, drifters, and lambsters from every state in the Union. People wander around, unrelated, purposeless, most of them looking vaguely sullen and hostile. This is a place where you enjoy yourself. Even the criminals have come here to cool off and relax. But a complex pattern of tensions like the electrical mazes devised by psychologists to unhinge the nervous systems of white rats and guinea pigs, keeps the unhappy pleasure seekers in a condition of unconsummated alertness. For one thing, New Orleans is inordinately noisy. The drivers orient themselves largely by the use of their horns, like bats. The residents are surly. The transient population is completely miscellaneous and unrelated, so that you never know what sort of behavior to expect from anybody. New Orleans was a strange town to me, and I had no way of making a junk connection. Walking around the city, I spotted several junk neighborhoods: St. Charles and Poydras, the area around and above Lee's Circle, Canal and Exchange Place. I don't spot junk neighborhoods by the way they look, but by the feel, somewhat the same process by which a dowser locates hidden water. I'm walking along, and suddenly the junk in my cells moves and twitches like the dowser's wand. Junk here. I didn't see anybody around, and besides, I wanted to stay off. Or at least I thought I wanted to stay off. In the French Quarter, there are several queer bars so full every night the fags spill out onto the sidewalk. A room full of fags gives me the horrors. They jerk around like puppets on invisible strings, galvanized into hideous activity. That is the negation of everything living and spontaneous. But I backslide now and then. One night, I got lobotomized drunk in Frank's and went to a queer bar. I must have had more drinks in the queer joint because there was a lapse of time. It was getting light outside when the bar hit one of those sudden pockets of quiet. The noise cleared like smoke, and I saw a red-haired kid was looking straight at me and standing about 3 feet away. He didn't come on faggish, so I said, "How are you making it?" or something like that. He said, "Do you want to go to bed with me?" I said, "Okay, let's go." We got to a hotel, and he put down some routine why he should go in first alone. I pulled some bills out of my pocket. He looked at them and said, "Better give me the 10. I gave it to him. He went in the hotel and came right out. "No rooms there," he said. "We'll try the Savoy." The Savoy was right across the street. "Wait here," he said. I waited about an hour, and by then it occurred to me what was wrong with the first hotel. It had no back or side door he could walk out of. I went back to my apartment and got my gun. I waited around the Savoy and looked for the kid through the French Quarter. About noon I got hungry and ate a plate of oysters with a glass of beer, and suddenly felt so tired that when I walked out of the restaurant my legs were folding under me as if someone were clipping me behind the knees. I took a cab home and fell across the bed without taking off my shoes. I woke up around 6 in the evening and went to Frank's. After 3 quick beers, I felt better. There was a man standing by the jukebox, and I caught his eye several times. He looked at me with a special recognition, like one queer looks at another. He looked like one of those terracotta heads that you plant grass in. A peasant face with peasant intuition, stupidity, shrewdness, and malice. The jukebox wasn't working. I walked the door and asked him what was wrong with it. He said he didn't know. I asked him to have a drink and he ordered Coke. He told me his name was Pat. "Do you want to score?" he asked. "I'm due to score in a few minutes. I've been trying to hustle the dough. If you buy me a cap, I can score for you." I said, "Okay." We walked around the corner past the NMU hall. "Wait here a minute," he said, disappearing into a bar. I half expected to get beat for my $4, but he was back in a few minutes. "Okay," he said, "I got it." I asked him to come back to my apartment to take a shot. We went back to my room, and I got out my outfit. It hadn't been used in 5 months. "If you don't have a habit, you better go slow with this stuff," he cautioned me. "It's pretty strong." I measured out about 2/3 of a cap. "Half is plenty," he said. "I tell you, it's strong." "This'll be all right," I said. But as soon as I took the needle out of the vein, I knew it wasn't all right. I felt a soft blow in the heart. Pat's face began to get black around the edges, the blackness spreading to cover his face. I could feel my eyes roll back in their sockets. I came to several hours later. Pat was gone. I was lying on the bed with my collar loosened. I stood up and fell to my knees. I was dizzy and my head ached. $10 were missing from my watch pocket. I guess he figured I wasn't going to need it anymore. Several days later, I met Pat in the same bar. "Holy Jesus," he said. "I thought you was dying. I loosened your collar and rubbed ice on your neck. You turned all blue. So I says, 'Holy Jesus, the man is dying. I'm getting out of here, me.'" A week later, I was hooked. I asked Pat about the possibilities of pushing in New Orleans. "The town is ate up with pigeons," he said. "It's really tough." So I drifted along, scoring through Pat. I stopped drinking, stopped going out at night, and fell into a routine schedule. A cap of junk 3 times a day, and the time in between to be filled somehow. Mostly I spent my time painting and working around the house. Manual work makes the time pass fast. Pat and I began pushing in a small way, just enough to keep up our habits. We only took care of people Pat knew well and was sure of. About this time, an anti-narcotics drive hit the town. The chief of police said, This strife is going to continue as long as there is a single violator left in this city. The state legislators drew up a law making it a crime to be a drug addict. They did not specify where or when or what they meant by drug addict. One day I was broke and I wrapped up a pistol to take it in town and pawn it. When I got to Pat's room, there were two people there. One was Red McKinney, a shriveled-up, crippled junkie. The other was a young merchant seaman named Cole. Cole did not have a habit at this time, and he wanted to connect for some weed. As it happened, I had several ounces of weed in my house. Cole agreed to buy 4 caps in exchange for 2 ounces of weed. We began looking for old Sam above Lee Circle. Old Sam was the man these days. It was after doing 12 years in Angola. He was not in the old frame rooming house where he lived. We drove around slowly. Every now and then Pat would see someone he knew and stop the car. No one had seen old Sam. "Those guys wouldn't tell you nothing," Pat said. "It hurts him to do anybody a favor." We parked the car near old Sam's rooming house, and McKinney walked down to the corner to buy a package of cigarettes. He came back limping fast and got in the car. "The law," he said. "Let's get out of here." We started away from the curb, and a prowl car passed us. I saw the cop at the wheel turn around and do a double take when he saw Pat. "They made us, Pat," I said. "Get going." Pat didn't need to be told. He gunned the car and turned the corner, heading for Carondelet. I turned to Cole, who was in the back seat. "Throw out that weed," I ordered. "Oh, wait a minute," Cole replied. "We may lose them." "Are you crazy?" I said. Pat, McKinney, and I yelled in chorus, "Throw it out!" We were on Carondelet, headed downtown. Cole threw the weed out, and it skidded under a parked car. Pat took the first right turn into a one-way street. The prowl car was coming down the same street from the other end, going the wrong way. An old cop trick. We were boxed in. And I heard Cole yell, "Oh, Lord, I've got another stick on me." The cops jumped up with their hands on their guns, but they did not draw them. They ran up to my car. One of them, the driver who had spotted Pat, had a big smile on his face. "Where'd you get the car, Pat?" he asked. The other cop opened the back door. "Everybody out," he said. McKinney and Cole were in the back seat. They got out and the cops went through them. Right away, the cop who spotted Pat found the stick of weed in Cole's shirt pocket. "I've got enough here to hold a whole bunch of them," he said. The cop had a smooth red face and he kept smiling all the time. The wagon arrived and we all got in. We were taken to the 2nd precinct. The cops looked at my car papers. They couldn't believe that the car was mine. I was searched at least 6 times by different people. Eventually, we were all locked in a cell about 6 by 8 feet. Pat smiled and rubbed his hands together. "There are going to be some sick fucking dope fiends in here," he said. A little later, the turnkey came and called my name. I was taken to a small room that opened off the reception room of the precinct. In the room were 2 detectives sitting at a table. One was tall and fat with a deep South frog face. The other was a middle-aged, stocky Irish cop. He was missing some front teeth, which gave his face a suggestion of hair lip. This type cop could just as well be an old-time rod-riding thug. There was nothing of the bureaucrat about him. The cop in charge was studying the papers of my car. Everything they had taken out of my pockets was spread on the table in front of him. A glasses case, identification papers, wallet, keys, a letter from a friend in New York. Everything but my pocket knife, which the smooth-faced cop in the patrol car had put in his pocket. Suddenly I remembered about that letter. The friend in New York who'd written it was a tea-head, and he pushed weed from time to time. He'd written to me asking the price of good weed in New Orleans. I asked Pat, who quoted me a tentative price of $40 per pound. In the letter on the table, my friend made reference to the $40 rate and said he wanted some at that figure. The frog-faced cop folded the car papers carefully and put them aside. He picked up the envelope and looked at the address and the postmark. Then he took the letter out. He read the letter to himself. Then he read aloud, skipping where there was no reference to weed. He put the letter down and looked at me. "Not only do you use weed," he said, "you peddle it too, and you've got a batch of this weed stashed somewhere." He looked at the letter. "About 40 pounds. He looked at me. "You better straighten yourself out." I didn't say anything. The old Irish cop said, "He's like all these guys. He ain't talking till they get their fucking ribs kicked in. Then they'll talk and be glad to talk." "We're going out and search your house," the frog-faced cop said. "If we find anything, your wife will be put in jail too. I don't know what will happen to your children. They'll have to go to some home." "Why don't you make the man a proposition?" the old Irish cop said. I knew that if they searched the house, they would find the stuff. "Call in the Federals and I'll show you where the stuff is," I said. "But I want your word that the case will be tried in federal and that my wife will not be molested." We went out and got in the car. The old cop was driving, and the captain was sitting in back with me. "This is it here," said the captain. The old cop stopped the car and honked. A man with a pipe came out of the house and got in the back seat. He looked at me and then looked away, puffing on his pipe. The man looked young in the dark, but when he passed under a streetlight, I saw that his face was wrinkled and he had black circles under the eyes. It was a clean-cut American boy face, a face that had aged but could not mature. I assumed that he was a federal agent. After smoking in silence for several blocks, the agent turned to me and took out his pipe. "Who are you scoring off now?" he asked. "It's hard to find a score now," I said. "Most of them have gone away." He asked what record I had, and I told him about the script case in New York. "How much time did you do on that?" he asked. "None. It's a misdemeanor in New York. Public health law. Public health law number 334, as I remember." "He's pretty well versed," said the old cop. When we got to the house, the captain grabbed me by the back of the belt. "Who's in there beside your wife?" I said, "Nobody." We came to the door, and the guy with the pipe showed my wife his hunk of tin and opened the door. I showed them the pound of weed I had in the house and a few caps of junk. This didn't satisfy the captain. He wanted 40 pounds of weed. "You're not coming up with all of it, Bill," he kept saying. "Come on now, we've shown you every courtesy." I told him there wasn't any more. The man with the pipe looked at me. "We want it all," he said. I said, "You've got it all." Finally, they collected the weed, the caps, and a .38 revolver I kept in the house and got ready to leave. "He belongs to Uncle now," said the captain to my wife as they left the house. They drove back to the 2nd Precinct, and I was locked in. This time I was locked in a different cell with 4 strangers, 3 of them addicts. I lay on the narrow wood bench, twisting from one side to the other. My body was raw, twitching, tumescent, the junk frozen flesh in agonizing thaw. I turned over on my stomach, and one leg slipped off the bench. I pitched forward, and the rounded edge of the bench, polished smooth by the friction of cloth, slid along my crotch. There was a sudden rush of blood to my genitals at the slippery contact. Sparks exploded behind my eyes. My legs twitched. The orgasm of a hanged man when the neck snaps. The turnkey opened the door of my cell. "Your lawyer's here to see you, Lee," he said. The lawyer looked at me quite a while before he introduced himself. "I can see you don't feel much like talking now," the lawyer began. "You're charged in state. I talked to the federal DA an hour ago on the phone and asked if he was going to take the case. He said, absolutely no. There's an illegal seizure involved, and under no circumstances will this office prosecute the case. I think I can get you over to the hospital for a shot," he said after a pause. "The man at the desk now is a good friend of mine. I'll go down and talk to him." 2 cops took me over to Charity Hospital in the wagon. The nurse at the receiving desk wanted to know what was wrong with me. "Emergency case," said one of the cops. "He fell off a building." The cop walked away and came back with a heavy-set young doctor with reddish hair and gold-rimmed glasses. The doctor asked a few questions and looked at my arms. Another doctor with a long nose and hairy arms walked up to put in his 2 cents. "After all, doctor," he said to his colleague, "there is the moral question. This man should have thought of all this before he started using narcotics." Yes, there is the moral question, but there is also a physical question. This man is sick. He turned to a nurse and ordered half a grain of morphine. As the wagon jolted along on the way back to the precinct, I felt the morphine spread through all my cells. My stomach moved and rumbled. A shot when you are very sick always starts the stomach moving. Normal strength came back to all my muscles. I was hungry and sleepy. About 11 the next morning, a bondsman came around so I could sign the bond. He had the embalmed look of all bondsmen, as though paraffin had been injected under the skin. My lawyer Ty showed up around 12 to check me out. He had made arrangements for me to go directly to a sanitarium to take a cure. He told me the cure was necessary from a legal point of view. We drove to a sanitarium in a police car with 2 detectives. An attendant took my clothes, and I lay down on a bed waiting for a shot. My wife came to see me and reported that the management did not know anything about junk or junkies. When I told them you were sick, they said, "What's wrong? What's the matter with him?" I told them you were sick and that you needed a shot of morphine. And they said, "Oh, we thought it was just a question of a marijuana habit." "A marijuana habit?" I said. "What in the hell is that?" "Find out what they plan to give me," I told her. "I need a reduction cure. If they aren't going to give me one, check me out of here right now." A few minutes later, a nurse came in with a hypo. It was Demerol. Demerol helps some, but it's not nearly as effective as codeine in relieving junk sickness. At 9 p.m., I got another shot of Demerol. This shot had no effect. The third day and night of junk sickness are generally the worst. After the third day, the sickness begins to recede. I felt a cold burn over the whole surface of my body, as though the skin was one solid hive. It seemed like ants were crawling around under the skin. It is possible to detach oneself from most pain. Injury to teeth, eyes, and genitals presents special difficulties, so that the pain is experienced as neutral excitation. From junk sickness, there seems to be no escape. Junk sickness is the reverse side of junk kick. The kick of junk is that you have to have it. Junkies run on junk time and junk metabolism. They are subject to junk climate. They are warmed and chilled by junk. The kick of junk is living under junk conditions. You cannot escape from junk sickness any more than you can escape from junk kick after a shot. I was too weak to get out of bed. I cannot lie still. In junk sickness, any conceivable line of action or inaction seems intolerable. A man might die simply because he could not stand to stay in his body. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I got another shot, which seemed to have some effect. As I learned later, this shot was not Demerol. I was even able to eat a little toast and drink some coffee. When my wife came to see me later in the day, she told me that they were using a new treatment in my case. When I was up and walking around, a psychiatrist came to interview me. He was very tall. He had long legs and a heavy body shaped like a pear with a narrow end up. He smiled when he talked, and his voice was whiny. He was not effeminate. He simply had none of whatever it is that makes a man a man. This was Dr. Fredericks, head psychiatrist of the hospital. He asked the question they all ask. Why do you feel that you need narcotics, Mr. Lee? When you hear this question, you can be sure that the man who asks it knows nothing about junk. I needed to get out of bed in the morning, to shave and eat breakfast. I mean, psychically. I shrugged. Might as well give him his diagnosis so he will go. It's a good kick. Junk is not a good kick. The point of junk to a user is that it forms the habit. No one knows what junk is until he is junk sick. The doctor nodded. Psychopathic personality. He stood up. Suddenly he moved his face into a smile that was obviously intended to be understanding and to dissolve my reticence. The smile took over and ended up an insane leer. He leaned forward and brought his smile close to my face. Is your sex life satisfactory? He asked. Do you and your wife have satisfactory relations? Oh, yes, I said, when I'm not on the junk. He straightened up. He did not like my answer at all. Well, I'll see you again. He blushed and lunged awkwardly for the door. He told my wife I had a very bad prognosis. I was feeling the shots less all the time, and after 8 days I began to pass them up. When I had passed the shots for 24 hours, I decided it was time to leave. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon when we left the hospital and took a cab to Canal Street. I went into a bar and drank 4 whiskey sodas and got a good lush kick. I was cured. As I walked across the porch of my house and opened the door, I had the feel of returning after a long absence. I was coming back to the point in time I left a year ago when I took that first joy bang with Pat. Pat came around as soon as he heard I was out. Said, I want to pick up. Just one wouldn't hurt any. He could get a good price on 10 or more. I said no. You don't need willpower to say no to junk when you are off. You don't want it. Besides, I was charged in state, and state junk raps pile up like any other felony. A few days later, I stopped by my lawyer's office to talk about the case and to ask whether I could leave the state. You're hot as a firecracker in this town, Ty told me. I have permission from the judge for you to leave the state, so you can go any time you like. I might want to take a trip to Mexico, I said. Would that be okay? So long as you're back here when your case comes up, there are no restrictions on you. One client of mine went to Venezuela. So far as I know, he's still there. He didn't come back. As soon as I hit Mexico City, I started looking for junk. At least, I always had one eye open for it. One day I was walking down San Juan Letran and passed a cafeteria that had colored tiles set in the stucco around the entrance, and the floor was covered with the same tile. The cafeteria was unmistakably Near Eastern. As I walked by, someone came out of the cafeteria. He was a type character you see only on the fringes of a junk neighborhood. As the geologist looking for oil is guided by certain outcroppings of rock, so certain signs indicate the near presence of junk. Junk is often found adjacent to ambiguous or transitional districts. East 14th near 3rd in New York, Poydras and St. Charles in New Orleans, San Juan Letran in Mexico City. Stores selling artificial limbs, wig makers, dental mechanics, loft manufacturers of perfumes, pomades, novelties, essential oils. A point where dubious business enterprise touches Skid Row. There's a type person occasionally seen in these neighborhoods who has connections with junk, though he is neither a user nor a seller. But when you see him, the dowser wand twitches. Junk is close. His place of origin is Near East, probably Egypt. He has a long, straight nose. His lips are thin and purple-blue like the lips of a penis. The skin is tight and smooth over his face. He is basically obscene beyond any possible vile act or practice. He has the mark of a certain trade or occupation that no longer exists. If junk were gone from the earth, there might still be junkies standing around in junk neighborhoods, feeding the lack, vague and persistent, a pale ghost of junk sickness. So this man walks around in the place where he once exercised his obsolete and unthinkable trade. But he is unperturbed. His eyes are black with an insect's unseeing calm. He looks as if he nourished himself on honey and Levantine syrups that he sucks up through a sort of proboscis. What is his lost trade? Definitely of a servant class, and something to do with the dead, though he is not an embalmer. Perhaps he stores something in his body, a substance to prolong life, of which he is periodically milked by his masters. He is specialized as an insect for the performance of some inconceivably vile function. I'd been in Mexico several months. One day I went to see the lawyer I had hired to get working and residence papers for me. A shabby, middle-aged man was standing in front of the office. "He ain't come yet," the man said. I looked at the man. He was an old-time junkie, no doubt about it. And I knew he didn't have any doubts about me either. We stood around talking, and the lawyer came. The junkie was there to sell some religious medals. The lawyer had told him to bring a dozen up to his office. After I'd seen the lawyer, I asked the junkie if he would join me for supper, and we went to a restaurant on San Juan Letran. The junkie asked me what my story was, and I told him. He flipped back his coat lapel and showed me a spike stuck in the underside of the lapel. "I've been on junk for 28 years, he said. "Do you want to score?" There is only one pusher in Mexico City, and that is Lupita. She has been in the business 20 years. Lupita got her start with 1 gram of junk and built up from there to a monopoly of the junk business in Mexico City. She weighed 300 pounds, so she started using junk to reduce. But only her face got thin, and the result is no improvement. Every month or so, she hires a new lover, gives him shirts and suits and wristwatches, and then packs him in when she has enough. Lupita pays off to operate wide open as if she were running a grocery store. She doesn't have to worry about stool pigeons because every law in the federal district knows that Lupita sells junk. She keeps outfits and glasses of alcohol so the junkies can fix in the joint and walk out clean. Lupita sells her stuff in papers. It is supposed to be heroin. Actually, it is pentapon cut with milk sugar and some other crap that looks like sand and remains undissolved in the spoon after you cook up. I started scoring for Lupita's papers through Ike, the old-time junkie I met in the lawyer's office. I'd been off junk 3 months at this time. It took me just 3 days to get back on. When my wife saw I was getting the habit again, she did something she had never done before. I was cooking up a shot 2 days after I connected with old Ike. My wife grabbed a spoon and threw the junk on the floor. I slapped her twice across the face, and she threw herself on the bed sobbing, then turned around and said to me, "Don't you want to do anything at all? You know how bored you get when you have a habit. It's like all the lights went out." "Oh, well, do what you want. I guess you have some stashed anyway." I did have some stashed. Lupita's papers cost 15 pesos each, about $2. They're half the strength of a $2 stateside cap. Ike told me she has to charge high because she pays off the law. So I asked Ike, what about scripts? He told me that Croakers could only prescribe M in solution. The most they were allowed to prescribe in one script was 15 centigrams, or about 2.5 grains. I figured it would work out a lot cheaper than Lupita, so we started hitting the Croakers. We located several who would write the script for 5 pesos, and 5 more would get it filled. Mexican croakers are not like stateside croakers. They never pull that professional man act on you. A croaker who will write it all will write without hearing a story. In Mexico City, there are so many doctors that a lot of them have a hard time making it. I know croakers who would starve to death if they didn't write morphine scripts. They don't have patient 1 unless you call Junky's patients. I was keeping up Ike's habit as well as my own, and it ran into money. At first we filled the scripts without too much trouble, but after a few weeks the scripts had piled up in the drugstores that would fill M scripts, and they began packing in. It looked like we would be back with Lupita. One of the script-writing doctors suggested to Ike that he apply for a government permit. Ike explained to me that the Mexican government issued permits to hypes, allowing them a definite quantity of morphine per month at wholesale prices. The doctor would put in an application for Ike for 100 pesos. I said, "Go ahead and apply," and gave him the money. I did not expect the deal to go through, but it did. 10 days later, he had a government permit to buy 15 grams of morphine every month. I remember the first time he filled the permit. A whole box full of cubes of morphine, like a junky's dream. I had never seen so much morphine before all at once. I put out the money and we split the stuff. 7 grains per month allowed me about 3 grains per day, which was more than I ever had in the States. So I was supplied with plenty of junk for a cost of $30 a month, as compared with about $300 a month in the U.S. Junk takes everything and gives nothing but insurance against junk sickness. Every now and then I took a good look at the deal I was giving myself and decided to take the cure. When you're getting plenty of junk, kicking looks easy. You say, "I'm not getting any kick from the shots anymore, I might as well quit." But when you cut down into junk sickness, the picture looks different. One morning in April, I woke up a little sick. I lay there looking at shadows on the white plaster ceiling. I remembered a long time ago when I lay in bed beside my mother, watching lights from the street move across the ceiling and down the walls. I felt the sharp nostalgia of train whistles, piano music down a city street, burning leaves. A mild degree of junk sickness always brought me the magic of childhood. It never fails, I thought, just like a shot. I wonder if all junkies score for this wonderful stuff. I went into the bathroom to take a shot. I was a long time hitting a vein. The needle clogged twice. Blood ran down my arm. The junk spread through my body, an injection of death. The dream was gone. I looked down at the blood that ran from elbow to wrist. I felt a sudden pity for the violated veins and tissue. Tenderly, I wiped the blood off my arm. "I'm going to quit," I said aloud. Then I started drinking. I had never been able to drink before when I was on the junk or junk sick. But eating hop is different from shooting the white stuff. You can mix hop and lush. At first, I started drinking at 5 in the afternoon. After a week, I started drinking at 8 in the morning. Stayed drunk all day and all night and woke up drunk the next morning. Every morning when I woke up, I washed down Benzedrine, Sanacine, and a piece of hop with black coffee and a shot of tequila. Then I lay back and closed my eyes and tried to piece together the night before and yesterday. Often I drew a blank from noon on. You sometimes wake up from a dream and think, "Thank God I didn't really do that." Reconstructing a period of blackout, you think, "My God, did I really do it?" The line between saying and thinking is blurred. Did you say it or just think it? After 10 days of the cure, I had deteriorated shockingly. My clothes were spotted and stiff from the drinks I had spilled all over myself. I had never bathed. I had lost weight. My hands shook. I was always spilling things, knocking over chairs and falling down. But I seemed to have unlimited energy and a capacity for liquor I never had before. My emotions spilled out everywhere. I was uncontrollably sociable and would talk to anybody I could pin down. I forced, distastefully, intimate confidences on perfect strangers. Several times I made the crudest sexual propositions to people who had given no hint of reciprocity. I was around every few days. "I'm glad to see you getting off, Bill. May I fall down and be paralyzed if I don't mean it. But if you get too sick and start to puke, here's 5 centigrams of M." Ike took a severe view of my drinking. "You're drinking, Bill. You're drinking and getting crazy. You look terrible. You look terrible in your face. Better you should go back to stuff than drink like this." I was in a cheap cantina off Dolores Street, Mexico City. I had been drinking for about 2 weeks. I was sitting in a booth with 3 Mexicans drinking tequila. The Mexicans were fairly well dressed. One of them spoke English. A middle-aged, heavy-set Mexican with a sad, sweet face sang songs and played the guitar. He was sitting at the end of a booth in a chair. I was glad the singing made conversation impossible. 5 cops came in. I figured I might get a shake, so I slipped the gun and holster out of my belt and dropped them under the table with a piece of hop I had stashed in a cigarette package. The cops had a quick beer and took off. When I reached under the table, my gun was gone, but the holster was there. I was sitting in another bar with a Mexican who spoke English. The singer and the other 2 Mexicans were gone. The place was suffused with a dim yellow light. A moldy-looking bullhead mounted on a plaque hung over the mahogany bar. Pictures of bullfighters, some autographed, decorated the walls. The word saloon was etched in the frosted glass swinging door. I found myself reading the word saloon over and over. I had the feeling of coming into the middle of a conversation. I inferred from the expression of the other man that I was in mid-sentence, but did not know what I had said or what I was going to say or what the discussion was about. I thought we must be talking about the gun. I'm probably trying to buy it back. I noticed the man had the piece of hop in his hand and was turning it over. "So you think I look like a junkie," he said. I looked at him. The man had a thin face with high cheekbones. The eyes were a gray-brown color, often seen in mixed Indian and European stock. He was wearing a light gray suit and a tie. His mouth was thin, twisted down at the corners. A junkie mouth for sure. There are people who look like junkies and aren't, just as some people look queer and aren't. It's a type that causes trouble. "I'm going to call a cop," he said, starting for a phone attached to a support pillar. I jerked the telephone out of the man's hand and pushed him against the bar so hard he bounced off it. The man smiled at me. His teeth were covered with a brown film. He turned his back and called the bartender over and showed him the piece of hop. I walked out and got a cab. I remember going back to my apartment to get another gun, a heavy-caliber revolver. I was in a hysterical rage, though exactly why I cannot, in retrospect, understand. I got out of a taxi and walked down the street and into the bar. The man was leaning against the bar, his gray coat pulled tight over his thin back and shoulders. He turned an expressionless face to me. I said, "Walk outside ahead of me." "Why, Bill?" he asked. "Go on, walk." I flipped the heavy revolver out of my waistband, cocking it as I drew, and stuck the muzzle in the man's stomach. With my left hand, I took hold of the man's coat lapel and shoved him back against the bar. It did not occur to me until later that the man had used my correct first name and that the bartender probably knew it too. The man was perfectly relaxed, his face blank with controlled fear. I saw someone approaching from behind on my right side and half turned my head. The bartender was closing in with a cop. I turned around, irritated at the interruption. I shoved the gun in the cop's stomach. "Who asked you to put in your 2 cents?" I asked in English. I was not talking to a solid, three-dimensional cop. I was talking to the recurrent cop of my dreams, an irritating, nondescript, darkish man who would rush in when I was about to take a shot or go to bed with a boy. The bartender grabbed my arm, twisting it to one side out of the cop's stomach. The cop stolidly hauled out his battered .45 automatic, placing it firmly against my body. I could feel the coldness of the muzzle through my thin cotton shirt. The cop's stomach stuck out. He had not sucked it in or leaned forward. I relaxed my hold on the gun and felt it leave my hand. I half raised my hands, palm out, in a gesture of surrender. All right, I said, and then added, "Bueno." The cop put away his .45. The bartender was leaning against the bar, examining the gun. The man in the gray suit stood there without any expression at all. "Está cargado. It's loaded," said the bartender, without looking up from the gun. I intended to say, "Of course, what good is an unloaded gun?" But I did not say anything. The cop took me firmly by the arm. "Vámonos, gringo," he said. I walked out with the cop. I felt limp and had difficulty controlling my legs. Once I stumbled and the cop steadied me. I was trying to convey the idea that while I had no money on my person, I could borrow some de amigos. My brain was numb. I mixed Spanish and English, and the word for borrow was hidden in some filing cabinet of the mind, cut off from my use by the mechanical barrier of alcohol-numbed connections. The cop shook his head. I was making an effort to reform the concept. Suddenly the cop stopped walking. "Andale, gringo," he said, giving me a slight push on the shoulder. The cop stood there for a minute, watching me as I walked on down the street. I waved. The cop did not respond. He turned and walked back the way he had come. I kept on drinking. Several days later, I passed out in the ship ahoy after drinking tequila for 8 hours steadily. Some friends carried me home. Next morning, I had the worst hangover of my life. I began vomiting at 10-minute intervals until I brought up green bile. Then old Ike was around. "You gotta quit drinking, Bill. You're getting crazy." I had never been so sick. Nausea racked my body like a convulsion. Old Ike was holding me up as I vomited a few spoonfuls of bile into the toilet. He put an arm around my shoulder and hugged me and helped me back to bed. About 5 in the afternoon, I stopped vomiting and managed to keep a bottle of grape juice and a glass of milk down. "It stinks like piss in here," I said. "One of them cats must have pissed under the bed." Ike began sniffing around the bed. No, nothing there. He sniffed some more near the head of the bed where I was lying propped up on pillows. "Bill, it's you smells like piss." "Huh?" I began smelling my hands with mounting horror as if I was discovering leprosy. "Good Lord," I said, my stomach cold with fear. "I got uremic poisoning. Ike, go out and get me a croaker." "Okay, Bill, I'll get you one right away. And don't come back with one of them 5-peso script-writing bums." "Okay, Bill." I lay there trying to control the fear. I did not know much about uremic poisoning. A woman I'd known slightly in Texas had died of it after drinking a bottle of beer every hour, night and day, for 2 weeks. Rollins had told me about it. She swelled up and turned sort of black and went into convulsions and died. The whole house smelled like piss. I relaxed, trying to tune in on my viscera and find out what the score was. I did not feel death or indication of grave illness. I felt tired, battered, languid. I lay there with my eyes closed in the darkening room. Old Ike came in with the doctor and turned on the light. The doctor sniffed and smiled and nodded. He had a round, smiling Oriental face. He made a quick examination and asked if I could urinate. Then, turning to Ike, he asked if I was subject to fits. Ike spoke in his halting Spanish, looking for each word. "Este señor huele muy malo y quiere saber por qué." This man smells very bad, and he wants to know why. The doctor explained it was an incipient uremia, but the danger was now past. I would have to stop drinking for a month. The doctor picked up an empty tequila bottle. One more of these and you were dead. He was putting away his instruments. He wrote out a prescription for an anti-acid preparation to take every few hours, shook hands with me and Ike, and left. Next day I had the chucks and ate everything in sight. I stayed in bed 3 days. The metabolic setup of alcoholism had ceased operating. When I started drinking again, I drank normally and never before the late afternoon. I stayed off the junk. When I jumped bail and left the States, the heat on junk already looked like something new and special. Initial symptoms of nationwide hysteria were clear. Louisiana passed a law making it a crime to be a drug addict. Since no place or time is specified and the term addict is not clearly defined, no proof is necessary or even relevant under a law so formulated. No proof and consequently no trial. This is police state legislation, penalizing a state of being. Other states were emulating Louisiana. I saw my chance of escaping conviction dwindle daily as the anti-junk feeling mounted to a paranoid obsession, like anti-Semitism under the Nazis. So I decided to jump bail and live permanently outside the United States. Refugee hipsters trickled down into Mexico. 6 months for needle marks under the vague addict law in California. 8 years for a dropper in Washington. 2 to 10 for selling in New York. A group of young hipsters drop by my place every day to smoke weed. No zoot-suiters, the hipster has gone underground. I learned the new hipster vocabulary. Pot for weed, twisted for busted. Cool and all-purpose word indicating anything you like or any situation that is not hot with the law. Conversely, anything you don't like is uncool. From listening to these characters, I got a picture of the situation in the U.S. A state of complete chaos where you never know who is who or where you stand. Peyote is a new kick in the States. It isn't under the Harrison Act, and you can buy it from herb dealers through the mail. I never tried peyote, and I asked Johnny White if he could score for peyote in Mexico. He said yes, a herb dealer here sells it. He invited all of us to come to his place and eat peyote with him. You can come along if you like. I want to see if he has anything I can take back to the States and sell there. Why not take back peyote? Doesn't keep. It rots or dries up in a few days and loses its kick. We went to the herb dealer's house, and he brought out a bowl of peyote, a grater, and a pot of tea. Peyote is a small cactus, and only the top part that appears above the ground is eaten. This is called a button. The buttons are prepared by peeling off the bark and fuzz and running the button through a grater until it looks like avocado salad. 4 buttons is the average dose for a beginner. We washed down the peyote with tea. I came near gagging on it several times. Finally, I got it all down and sat there waiting for something to happen. Peyote high is something like a Benzedrine high. You can't sleep and your pupils are dilated. Everything looks like a peyote plant. I was driving in the car and Johnny said, "Look at the bank along the road. It looks like a peyote plant." I turned around to look and was thinking, what a damn silly idea. People can talk themselves into anything. But it did look like a peyote plant. Everything I saw looked like a peyote plant. Our faces swelled under the eyes, and our lips got thicker through some glandular action of the drug. We actually looked like Indians. The others claimed they felt primitive and were laying around on the grass and acting the way they figured Indians act. I didn't feel any different from ordinary, except high like on Benny. The young hipsters seemed lacking in energy and spontaneous enjoyment of life. The mention of pot or junk will galvanize them like a shot of coke. They jump around and say, "Too much. Man, let's pick up. Let's get loaded." But after a shot, they slump into a chair like a resigned baby waiting for life to bring the bottle again. I found that their interests were very limited. Bill Gaines threw in the towel and moved to Mexico. I met him at the airport. He was loaded on H and goofballs. His pants were spotted with blood where he had been fixing on the plane with a safety pin. You make a hole with a pin and put the dropper over, not in the hole, and the solution goes right in. With this method, you don't need a needle, but it takes an old-time junkie to make it work. You have to use exactly the right degree of pressure feeding in the solution. I tried it once, and the junk squirted out to the side, and I lost it all. But when Gaines made a hole in his flesh, the hole stayed open waiting for junk. Bill was an old-timer. He knew everybody in the business. He had an excellent reputation, and he could score as long as anyone sold junk. I figured the situation must be desperate when Bill packed in and left the States. "Sure, I can score," he told me, "but if I stay in the States, I'll wind up doing about 10 years. I took a shot with him, and the what happened to so-and-so routine set in. Old Bart died on the island. Louie the bellhop went wrong. Tony and Nick went wrong. Herman didn't make parole. The gimp got 5 to 10. Marvin the waiter died from an overdose. What about Roy?" I asked. "Didn't you hear about him? He went wrong and hanged himself in the Tombs." Roy had always taken an intolerant and puritanical view of pigeons. "I don't see how a pigeon can live with himself," he said to me once. I asked Bill about child addicts. He nodded and smiled a sly, gloating smile. "Yes, Lexington is full of young kids now." At this time, I was not on junk, but I was a long way from being clear in the event of an unforeseen shake. There was always some weed around, and people were using my place as a shooting gallery. I was taking chances and not making 1 centavo. I decided it was about time to move out from under and head south. When you give up junk, you give up a way of life. I've seen junkies kick and hit the lush and wind up dead in a few years. Suicide is frequent among ex-junkies. Why does a junkie quit junk of his own will? You never know the answer to that question. No conscious tabulation of the disadvantages and horrors of junk gives you the emotional drive to kick. The decision to quit junk is a cellular decision, and once you've decided to quit, you cannot go back to junk permanently any more than you could stay away from it before. Like a man who's been away a long time, you see things different when you return from junk. I read about a drug called yahe used by Indians in the headwaters of the Amazon. Yahe is supposed to increase telepathic sensitivity. A Colombian scientist isolated from yahe a drug he called telepathy. I know from my own experience that telepathy is a fact. I have no interest in proving telepathy or anything to anybody. But I do want usable knowledge of telepathy. What I look for in any relationship is contact on the nonverbal level of intuition and feeling. That is telepathic contact. Apparently, I'm not the only one interested in yahe. The Russians are using the drug in experiments on slave labor. They want to induce states of automatic obedience and literal thought control. The basic con. No build-up, no routine, just move in on someone's psyche and give orders. The deal is certain to backfire because telepathy is not in itself a one-way setup or a setup of sender and receiver at all. I decided to go down to Colombia and score for yahe. Bill Gaines is squared away with old Ike. My wife and I are separated. I'm ready to move on south and look for the uncut kick that opens out instead of narrowing down like junk. Kick is seeing things from a special angle. Kick is momentary freedom from the claims of the aging, cautious, nagging, frightened flesh. Maybe I will find in yahe what I was looking for in junk and weed and coke. Yahe may be the final fix.